to wander.
So try not to wander.
Try not to wander. No, that's fine. We don't wander much, do we?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Grand Rounds. The first thing to say is if you think you're about to listen to a lecture on social prescribing, that is in the Gannicke Lecture Theatre, so don't feel too embarrassed about leaving. The rooms did swap around. This is Grand Rounds, and we're going to hear about an update of the medical school curriculum review. So the last chance, if you're in the wrong room, just don't worry. Okay, my name's Tom Farden and I'm Chair of Grand Rounds, and I'm very pleased to host a Grand Round where the medical school takes over. Many of you will know that I spent quite a lot of time in the medical school going through various bits of curriculum review and changing of the curriculum with Ellie when we worked together as co-conveners of what was Systems in Practice, and probably still is but might not be for much longer. So we're all involved in teaching medical students in some way or other. We all have a vested interest in this. And the curriculum, Ellie's going to tell you about this, but how difficult it is in the modern world to try to cram in everything that we need to teach our future doctors in just 6 years of a medical degree, which is really only 5 years. And as things roll on, there is review. The review was 2 weeks ago. I was privileged enough to go along to that as a sort of external observer from the postgraduate world, and really impressed by the enthusiasm that was in the room and the number of people who came along to that meeting to try to revitalise the medical school curriculum. So Ellie is here. She is the lead for the undergraduate curriculum in the medical school, and she's going to start off, and then Professor Maggie Bartlett, who's the head of the Centre for Medical Education. No? Education and General Practice. I knew I'd get something wrong. It only took 3 minutes. And she's going to do the middle bit, and then Ellie's going to finish off. Is that right?
That's right.
Fantastic. And I'm sure there's time for questions.
Of course.
Absolutely. So thanks very much for coming, and thanks, Ellie.
Thanks very much, Tom. Hello. As Tom said, we're not social prescribing. I have a sneaky suspicion there may be people in the social prescribing lecture theatre at the moment thinking this does not sound much like curriculum review. So we may yet be joined by other people. We can but hope. Some of you were at the away day 2 weeks ago, and so I hope that this isn't too much of a repeat of what you heard then. But what we were going to do was to introduce you to the background to the curriculum review so far. Maggie's done an enormous... What did I say? Maggie's done an enormous amount of work with Jen Kennedy, who's the Systems in Practice lead, to really work out the strengths and some of the weaknesses of our existing curriculum, because we're not starting from nothing. We're starting from an excellent course which produces excellent graduates. So what we want to do is to future-proof and improve what we do rather than like I say, starting from scratch. So a bulk of this presentation really is presenting that groundwork so far, and then explaining to you where we've got to and the model that we hope to take forward for development. And then once Maggie's outlined that bit for you, then I'm going to leap back in and just summarise really what we discussed in the second half of the away day and where we are now. And the idea is we leave plenty of time today for questions, suggestions, volunteers, that kind of thing. So without further ado, I will hand over to Maggie.
I haven't looked behind me to see how many people were in the room, and it's a good number, so thank you all for coming along. As Ellie said, I've been involved in the sort of data gathering part of the process. And it's really that I'm going to present to you now. So for those of you who were in the meeting on the 27th of February, you will have heard all of this before, and for that I apologise. So just starting off, this is the process that we've been using for the curriculum review, which is this double diamond design process, where you start off at the left-hand end, trying to actually tease out what the problems are. To define them, and then to bring it to the central point where you actually do know what the problems are, and then from that point on broaden out discussions around potential solutions, and then start to deliver the solutions that you believe will work, and end up at the end point. So where we are at the moment is just where it broadens out after the central point. I think we're probably about halfway up those upward and downward slopes there, so very much in the designing and developing solutions phase. I'm going to start off by just showing you some of the rules that we have to abide by and the guidance and the structures that we have to think about. And this is the main one. This is the General Medical Council's kind of map of the 10 standards of an undergraduate medical curriculum. And as the regulator, we have to make sure that we take all of these into account. When the GMC comes to see us, they will judge us by these standards. So it's quite important that we know and can talk about our curriculum from the perspective of these, 5 themes, but 10 standards. But I'm not going to go into them in huge detail now. The other set of documents that we have to work to are mainly this one, Outcomes for Graduates, which was updated in 2018. So there was no point at all in our curriculum review trying to start defining outcomes because we already have them, they already exist. The other bit that comes into the mix is the medical licensing assessment, which is a new thing that's being developed by the GMC. And I think from 2023, all doctors who are practicing in the UK have to have passed this, as well as their own institution's exams. So that's another thing that, while we don't know the details of it yet, we've had to keep in our minds when we've been thinking about our curriculum, because we have to make sure that our students are ready to take and pass this exam, or these exams. The other bit is the Scottish Government and their ideas about practicing realistic medicine. So whatever we do in our curriculum, it makes sense to make sure that we're addressing these areas that realistic medicine requires of us all. So these are kind of what we're working to. Just staying with Outcomes for Graduates for now, I'm sure you're all aware that it's divided up into these 3 main outcomes. The professional values and behaviours one, professional skills, and interestingly, the third one, professional knowledge. It used to be the other way round, but now in this new iteration, the professional values and behaviours has been made the first outcome. And then, obviously, as you move down the layers, there's more detail about the stuff that we need to cover. And the other bit that it's worth just focusing on that is involved in the Outcomes for Graduates document is the idea that medical students in the middle of the picture here have to take responsibility for their own learning. So the GMC is very clear that as a medical school we provide an education that allows students, newly qualified doctors, to meet the outcomes for graduates, and the local education providers, which I guess many of you are, the NHS, has to provide placements that allow students to see patients safely and get involved in the care of patients, but the responsibility for learning stays with the medical students. And then the GMC just makes sure all of that works together. One of the things that we talked about in the consultations we had with lots of people was this question about what kind of graduate we want. Some medical schools have got very clear ideas that they want to produce researchers, and some want hospital doctors, some want GPs, and some want various other kinds of doctors. But what everybody here seems to want are sound clinicians with the potential to be whatever kind of doctor they want. And I think the emphasis is really on that, the sound clinicians part. We need to make sure that our graduates can do the job. And then teasing that out a little bit more, we got to these other ideas that really one of the chief roles of a doctor is to make good clinical decisions. So we want our curriculum to be able to focus on that. And other aspects of the taking responsibility, being able to communicate, working in teams, managing their ongoing learning, and then these last 2, which is about seeing ways of doing things differently, being creative in that, but also being resilient. And we all know that the NHS is not always an easy place to work in, so that resilience is really important. And then we did a bit of thinking about what kind of course we want. And there's some arguments for something a bit like this, that's solid, safe, reliable, gets you from A to B in a reasonable degree of comfort, but maybe isn't the most exciting thing. Or something a bit more like this, which is more exciting and has this kind of high performance label attached to it. And what we've sort of concluded really is that we need our programme to be both. It needs to do the job of getting the students from their point where they start to being a safe, sound clinician, but we also want them to be excited and exhilarated at some points along the way. And some students may want more of one kind of course and some may want more of the other kind. But the point is that we can meet the needs of all of our students. Just going to step back a little bit now and look at our existing curriculum. And there are various iterations of this kind of thing. So a spiral within a cone. And then at the bottom, which I'm not really expecting you to read, are the 21 themes that go along with these 3 phases and multiple vertical bits within each cone. It's quite difficult to get your head around as a newcomer. I only came to Dundee about 18 months ago, and it's not easy to look at that and know what the curriculum is like. Having said that, it works. It does work, it's just difficult to see it. So I've got some evidence now about how we know that it does work. And starting off with this GMC data, this is the proportion of foundation doctors who felt adequately prepared for their first post by UK medical school. The blue line at the top is Dundee, the red one is the UK average. And as you can see, Dundee is consistently has been above the UK average since 2012. If we put in the other Scottish medical schools, we're still above those. And then if we make it really messy and put in all the UK schools, I'll just go back so you can see where that blue line for Dundee at the top is. We're still pretty much up there at the top. So our students, when they graduate, are amongst the best, well, they feel amongst the best prepared in the UK for their foundation jobs, which is something to be really proud of. Then looking at the National Prescribing Safety Assessment, which the students take in Year 5, we're the third one in, with the big blue arrow pointing at it, and Dundee students perform above the average, which is also very reassuring. And then looking at the Common Content Exam performance, these are questions that are in a national exam question bank, and we use a proportion of those questions in our assessments every year. And this data is a little bit old, but we were 7th out of 26 medical schools back in 2015-16, which is impressive. And again, the Dundee students are performing above the average. Then we thought it was quite important to have a look and see what our graduates are doing. And if you look at this, which is looking at the percentage of graduates on the specialist register, then the GP register, then the percentage in training and the percentage not in training, you can see that we're not outliers compared with the other Scottish schools. So we're in line with the Scottish schools generally. And I think that's a good thing, particularly with the final column with the percentage of graduates not in training. It's good that we're not outliers in that one. Then some more information. This is the proportion of graduates appointed to core training or specialty training post F2. And again, we're kind of in the middle. The red bit of the bar is GP training, the green bit is psychiatry, and the purple bit is other specialties. So we're kind of in the middle for all of those. Again, not an outlier. These are the specialty exam pass rates for doctors in specialty training. And we're ranked 19th. And so again, we're not an outlier. We're in the middle third. So that's another reassurance that our curriculum's working. And if we look at that, going back to 2014, we kind of hover around that rank of 19th, but we're not swinging about too wildly. And obviously, there's lots and lots of factors that influence this. But looking at this, I think we're pretty consistently performing in the middle of the bunch. Then in 2017, there was a GMC National Review of Scotland, and Dundee was part of that. And these are the areas that the GMC highlighted as working well back then. And we've put these ones in red because they're ones that are particularly notable, that the GMC have noted that the culture of the medical school values and supports education and training, which is great. And then there's this integration of clinical and basic sciences, which is also a good thing. And that they highlighted this particular benefit we have, which is the fact that the medical school is located in the hospital, which should give students really good opportunities for being involved in the hospital, for interacting with hospital staff and feeling part of it all. And I think that's something we can build on. The requirements, the one I've highlighted here is about capacity, and I expect this chimes with all of you. We know that capacity is a problem. We know the NHS is really busy, and it is sometimes difficult to find placements for students. And that's been picked up by the GMC. It's something that we're very aware of and need to work at and on. And then some recommendations, and the one here is about the timetabling delivery of the basic science lectures in the early years of the programme. I'm not sure exactly what it was they picked up about that, but again, it's something that we're looking at and thinking about. This next one comes from the National Student Survey that all students are invited to participate in Year 5. And in this, the filled-in circles are the medical school. The unfilled-in schools unfilled-in circles are the other departments in the university, the schools in the university. So the one that we're a bit concerned about here is assessment and feedback. And looking at the free text that goes along with this survey, it seems to be about the feedback that is the issue that students raise, that they don't feel that feedback comes to them quickly enough and sometimes isn't useful for them, and part of that is the fact that it comes too late. So feedback, looking at feedback is going to be a real focus of what we do to try and develop the curriculum. The other one that is just slightly concerning is the academic support. And again, when you look at the free text of this, it's not about the academic support system generally, it's about the routine provision of academic support in a continuous way throughout the 5 years. So when students have problems and they want to access academic support, it's fine, but it's the non-acute kind of support that they're not so happy about. The other thing that we've also had to bear in mind when thinking about the curriculum is the Scottish Government have had a look at this report that was actually commissioned by Health Education England, but is very relevant to Scotland as well, is to do with the crisis in GP recruitment specifically. And the Scottish Government are at the moment suggesting that 25% of curricular time should be spent in general practice. It's not completely clear whether that means placements in practices or GP-led and delivered teaching more centrally. And there's a consultation going on at the moment which is due to report this spring, which will hopefully come up with a firmer idea of what that means and what exactly it is we're going to be required to do. But obviously if we move to a situation of 25% of curricular time in general practice, that has implications for the rest of the curriculum and how we distribute topics and subjects and clinical areas amongst the time that we have left. So that was all external data. What we also did was do a lot of consulting with people who are involved in teaching students at the moment, so we've got lots of internal data, a wide variety of different groups of people and individuals that we talk to, and that's what we sort of brought together to put with the external data to decide what we're going to do next. So this is going to be a big slide. Where we're starting here is with the kind of ring of capacity around the edge, because whatever we do, we have to make sure that we have the capacity to deliver it. And we're kind of starting from the capacity position and thinking, right, okay, what capacity do we have? And then therefore, what can we do within the limits of that to do the best we can for the students? So that's why we start, that's why it's around the edge. We know about the outcomes, I mentioned those at the start. We did quite a lot of thinking about content. And one of the general feelings from all the consultation was that our curriculum is very content heavy. We have a lot of things that we require the students to learn. And there were some concerns that not all of those things are core. So it's about going back to basics in a way and trying to decide what core knowledge is. And then how we start in year 1 with that core knowledge, or start off the learning of that core knowledge, and then how we build on it over the rest of the programme. And then how we apply it, or how we help students to apply it to clinical practice. So very much a progressive and a development from the building blocks of knowledge building up through the curriculum. The general feeling is that the 3 to 2 overall structure works well. So those 3 years that at the moment are known as SIP, which are predominantly, less clinical, and then the 2 years which are currently known as PIP, so years 4 and 5, which are more clinical. And that structure seemed to be working. But there was a general feeling that this idea of a spiral, so a progressive development of knowledge, had kind of slipped and distorted a little bit over the years, and that needs to be restored. There was quite a lot of worry that the principals block, so that's the block right at the start in year 1, is too crammed, full of stuff, and happens too early for the students. At a time when they've just moved to Dundee, they're moving out of a school-based education system into university and just to settling in, and then to sort of hit them with that intense learning right at the start perhaps isn't the best thing. So we need to look at that. And then the other thing that the students have brought up is the block lengths, particularly in year 4, where they feel they're moved through blocks very quickly and don't really get a chance to settle into them. And want some more sort of continuity of educational supervision and educational input. I'm not going to focus too much on the documentation stuff. That's really about just helping people to be able to find documentation that supports their teaching and supports the students' learning. At the moment, there's a perception that it's not always easy to find information. So that's a sort of specific piece of work that we need to do. Then changing tack a little bit. The other thing that came out, not as a problem necessarily, but an area that we do need to focus on, are a whole series of different relationships. So these are relationships between the university and the NHS, between the medical school and the students, between the supervisors and the students. And one of the things that's come out of this is the idea that it would be good to reinforce or strengthen the idea of a community of practice, where we're all working to the same end, which is patient care, ultimately, and how we can involve students in that community of practice as legitimate participators in it, rather than people who are observing or sometimes feeling that they're getting in the way of it. So the community of practice is quite an important thing to look at. Then we need to have a look at teaching methods. There's been some discussion about whether lectures should be compulsory and students should sign in and that kind of thing. Some concerns from people giving lectures that they work hard developing a lecture and then they come to deliver it and the lecture theatre's not got many people in it, and how we can address that. For some clinical teachers where the 10 4-week blocks, so throughout year 4 they may end up delivering the same tutorial 10 times. Can we do something differently there? And something else about and this is linked back to the GP part of the teaching and the Scottish Government's requirements, but also its desirability on its own, is can we look more at the continuum of medical care? So whenever there's a clinical lecture that may currently be delivered by somebody who works in a secondary care setting, can we involve somebody from primary care to deliver truly joint lectures, which looks at that continuum of care, perhaps focused on patients and patients' experiences of the management of their illness. Then lots and lots of stuff about resources. This is people, so time for clinical teaching. Some of it's about rooms, spaces on wards and in other places where teaching can happen. Some of it's about underused resources. So, for example, could we do more teaching in out-of-hours settings? Could we do more teaching in community settings? Can we make use of teaching clinics that aren't, or potential teaching clinics that aren't being used to their full capacity already? Can we involve others in teaching? So not just consultants, but doctors from other grades and other healthcare professionals. How can we bring them in to help with the capacity? Can we use the Clinical Skills Centre more? Can we do more in the way of simulation? The Star Weeks that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which on the one hand could look like a bit of a threat to teaching, can we make that an opportunity? And the same with public holidays, with the changes to the junior doctors' public holidays for reasons that I don't fully understand, to do with NHS Grampian, I think. And then how do we develop our faculty? How do we help people to become better teachers? A specific concern of students are the cancelled sessions. We recognise that clinical care has to take priority over teaching many times, and sessions do have to be cancelled. That's unavoidable, but it's what we can do to give students learning opportunities when they are cancelled? You know, can we be doing things with podcasts and webinars and things like that? Can we have sign-ups in other areas that they could go and join in with? But just thinking creatively about managing that. And facilities is to do with upgrading facilities and investment in that. Quite a lot of discussion about IT. And one of the grumbles here is about how useful the learning support platforms are, and the challenge is because there's so many of them, with Delta and Moodle and Medblogs, and how you know where your stuff is and how to get to it and how it's updated. So whether we can do something smarter to make that easier for people. And can we capitalise on IT-based teaching methods, so recording lectures and tutorials and things like that? And how do we involve the technology and learning and teaching team more effectively in our teaching? Then I'm not going to spend too much time talking about assessment because, as I said, with the MLA being still slightly uncertain, it makes no sense to go into too much detail on this, but we do have to think about how our exams become MLA compliant, how we involve the ScotGem students who are going to be coming into our clinical teaching areas the year after next, how the ScotGem students' assessments fit in, and whether we can do something in the way of having a more usable document than the Rocky book, something more like a skills passport. So students can have a document that they can hand to clinical teachers who can then see fairly easily what they can do and what they can't do and what they need to develop and work on. We need to do quite a lot of work on the portfolio, which at the moment is a difficult area, but that's in hand. Like I highlighted earlier on, we need to do something quite significant about feedback and how useful and timely that is. Whether there's a better way of doing it, can we have apps on students' phones so they just hand their phone to the supervisor who fills in a form, hands it back, and then it's done without having to go off and find a PC and remember your login and all that kind of stuff. And whether our workplace-based assessment forms are actually fit for purpose, which I know there's a lot of feeling that they're not, and whether we can change that pretty rapidly so that they're better. And what's next? This is about student evaluation. So when students give us feedback, how we respond to it and how we close the loop to let the students know how we've responded to it. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. That's the summary of all the data that we gathered from the consultation with everybody here. And the kind of information that's informing the next steps. Just going to remind you of what kind of graduate we want. So these sound clinicians with the potential and all of these attributes that we need them to have. And just step a little bit into a little bit of theory here. So we know that the students need the professional skills and behaviours, and we know that part of that is the clinical skills and the ethical aspects and the professional values and behaviours. We also need them to develop a professional identity. Thinking about how students, how graduates, how doctors make decisions, the theory behind clinical reasoning teaching and learning is kind of this, that students need a good knowledge of basic science, they need knowledge of the basic mechanisms of disease, they need to know about illnesses, the specific information about illnesses, and they need then to see patients, to develop a bank of exemplars that they can then keep in their mind and use to compare new presentations to and things like that. So we need all this teaching, but we also need students to spend time in the clinical environment so they can gather their own exemplars. Because while we all, as experienced clinicians, have those, we can't hand them on. Students have to get their own. So we need to make sure all that can happen. Alongside that, we need the students to be able to handle information. It's no good just teaching them stuff and expecting that to be static. There are various quotes about half the stuff you learn in medical school will be out of date in 5 years' time, but the problem is nobody knows which half. So we need our students to be able to critically appraise new stuff, decide whether it's credible, decide whether it needs to be applied or not. And we need to also teach them how to use population level data when they're consulting with individuals. It's all part of keeping up to date. And I mentioned resilience at the start. Well, this is really all about feeling connected. So for students to feel that they're part of a community of practice, that they have a role. Within that, they've got some autonomy to choose how and when and what they learn, and to revisit that learning when they need to. They need to feel competent. Even if their contribution to clinical care is fairly minimal. They need to feel that they're doing it competently. And obviously they need to feel supported. Again, I'm not going to go into the assessment bit just now. So, we did quite a lot of thinking about the curriculum structure, thinking back to those kind of helical things within cones with bits hanging out the bottom and things like that that we started off with. We did think a little bit about the spiral structure. We thought a little bit about buildings, and whether you think in terms of building blocks and then pillars and pediments and roofs and doors and all those sorts of things. We also had some discussion about whether we should think more in terms of a bridge, of getting students from one place to another safely, with scaffolding and pillars and things. We had a little bit of a think about layers and how you start off at the bottom and move up layers. Then something about platforms and scaffolding. And there was even a little bit of discussion about an igloo. And this really came from the idea that the cone starts from a point of nothing, and our students don't start from that point. They come with a quite a broad base of education, so that's why we were thinking about igloos. And all of these pictures, as I'm sure you'll know, are from Dundee. Even the igloo was a Dundee igloo. But the point of this is it doesn't really matter what we call our curriculum structure. The point of it is that it's reiterative, so it builds on the students' existing knowledge, gives them new knowledge, and then keeps on building on that new knowledge several times up through the 5 years and beyond. So we're not going to get too fixated on what we call it, as long as it works. So what we've come up with is this idea of a continuum or a progression, starting in year 1 and obviously moving up to years 4 and 5. And looking at the areas of outcomes for graduates, it's about starting simple and then making it more complex as we go up. So for the professional values and behaviours, we're looking at learning the principles in year 1, throughout year 1, and then moving into observing those behaviours in clinical practice, and then moving through to actually adopting and enacting those behaviours when they're in years 4 and 5, when they're in clinical practice. Similarly with the skills, it's a question of starting off safely in the clinical skills centre, moving up into a mixture of clinical skills and clinical settings, and then actually in years 4 and 5 having an active role in service delivery with supervision, but then having ongoing development of procedural skills in clinical skills as well. And this is where the skills passport idea might come in. Similar kind of situation with knowledge, starting off with building blocks and then developing those and then applying them, but always with reference back to that basic science and basic mechanisms of disease. We feel that clinical experience is really important and that starts really early. It's something we get a lot of feedback about, something that students are very interested in when they come for their admissions interviews. So we would like to look again at the clinical experience continuum, and think about what we want from it in those really early years, how not to overwhelm the students with too much too soon, but to give them some really good learning, and then sequentially develop that as they go up towards year 5. Then we think it's really important to have this clinical reasoning strand. The real role of doctors, as we touched on at the start, is about making good clinical decisions. So overtly and explicitly teaching them to do that seems like a good thing to be doing. Prescribing and therapeutics, again, a real sort of linchpin of clinical work, needs to build on early principles and then come into the practicalities of it in clinical environments. And then this is the kind of Ferrari bit, really, the student selected components. What excites them and what do they really want to look at more, and how can we have a developmental progression in that so that they can have that autonomy to do more of what they want to do. So this is kind of what we're suggesting as the overall curriculum structure, which I think is probably a little bit simpler to understand than the previous one. It's not completely finished yet. There may be some refinements, but this is kind of what we're working on. So we know there are some challenges, and one of the big things to start with is defining what is core knowledge, what they absolutely need to know, and what is interest-based rather than core. We know there are challenges about service delivery versus teaching in both primary and secondary care. We know about the constraints of rooms and physical spaces, And we also are aware that we do need to have things more clearly mapped and documented, but we absolutely don't want to stifle flexibility and creativity. And then we need to work better with IT. I'm just going to go into a bit of detail on capacity now, to set the scene for what we're working with. So these are our projected numbers going forward into 2021-22. And the highlighted ones are where we've got the ScotGem students joining us in year 4 and 5. So you can see that from our current position of round about 170 in a year group, we're suddenly going to get quite significantly larger year groups. This doesn't take into account students who don't progress or students who intercalate, but the figures are, this is what we're going to be working with. And in year 4, these are the placements that we've got at the moment. So in most of the clinical specialties, we're around about the 200 mark, although for general surgery it's 290, which is a bit more. But the students that we're going to need to accommodate around about the 240 mark. So we've got some work to do to find either different ways of delivering teaching or more places to do something more similar in. And I think what we're looking at predominantly is working smarter. And this is for year 5, so again we're looking at around about sort of 200 to 250 places, and that looks much better in some cases, but not in others. And in general practice, we've got a challenge as well. At the moment, our teaching practices offer us just over 2,000 weeks a year. Once ScotGem's on board, we'll need nearer 3,000. And if the government does decide to go ahead with its idea of 25% of clinical curricular time being in general practice, we're nearer 6,000 weeks. So that's something that we're feeding back to the government, because all 5 medical schools in Scotland obviously will have the same requirement, and there just isn't really the capacity to fit them all in. There's another group of students that we need to take into consideration. Those are the students who come to us through the Widening Access programme, who perhaps have need for more input in the early years of the programme. We have some international students and some St Andrews students who join us in year 3, who may have particular needs. And then we have students with special circumstances, so either care responsibilities or health circumstances that may need particular consideration. So, to summarise, we know the curriculum works. There's lots of evidence that it does, but we know that we need to improve it. And this is what we think we need to do. So we need to sort out the core knowledge, restore the progression, make sure that students can apply their knowledge in clinical practice, make sure they're taught to make good decisions, help them to feel that they're more involved in co-providing care rather than observing it and getting in the way. We need to improve feedback, and we need to make sure that when students give us feedback, we act on it and let them know what we've done. And then we need to use the resources we have well, and that's both IT and our clinical teaching capacity. And I'm going to stop at that point and hand over to Ellie.
Thanks, Maggie. So this is the main summary slide from the actual away day. So we were fortunate enough to have someone with us from a company called Illustration Live, I think. Live Illustration, get it the right way around. And Pete from that, he took notes through the day and drew cartoons of us as we were going along. I'm particularly flattered of the picture of me in the middle on the left-hand side. Apparently the step in the back of my haircut is more noticeable than I thought it was. We have a paper version of this, the original paper version of this, which we're trying to work out how we can put on display so that you can come and have a look at it and I was going to say interact with it, but the whole point is we're trying to work out how we can display it in a way that when you interact with it, it doesn't break. This picture went out in the newsletter this week, and you can obviously have a copy for your own personal use if you'd like one. And my plan with this now is to take the key messages that this cartoon helped us to distill, which captured a lot of the key points being made by people on the day and used those as little themes to remind us as we go on of what it was that we agreed was important. What were our key principles, so that we keep coming back to those key messages and making sure that what we're doing is consistent with what we have been discussing as we go along. I'll come back to this at the end. I've only got 2 slides left. We are at the point now where we, having spent all of this time gathering all this information, which Maggie has described to you so well, now we need to transform all of this talking and all of these lovely slides into some changes. So some things we can fix fairly quickly, and we are not waiting for a set go date to do them. We are just creating the energy needed to get it done and working out what needs to be done. So those will roll out as soon as we can. But generally speaking, what we're talking about is setting up task and finish groups for specific elements of this, running those over the next while, reporting back regularly through UMEC as the main reporting mechanism for that. That's the Undergraduate Medical Education Committee, for those of you who aren't familiar with my acronyms. Talking too fast. And our go date for the official new curriculum is the beginning of the academic year 21-22. The task and finish groups we have identified so far are these. So you will recognise these from the themes that Maggie has just outlined. I've added to the bottom of the list that we have been drawing up and discussing assessment. So assessment, as Maggie's indicated, has been sitting slightly separately from the rest of the curriculum review. This is because we are really slightly hamstrung at the moment by waiting to hear what happens with the medical licensing assessment from the GMC. Until we know what that's going to look like, we're a bit struggling to work out what changes we will be required to make to assessment in years 4 and 5. And until we know that, we can't really make decisions about what we want to do for the rest of the summative assessment programme. But it doesn't mean that we aren't thinking and planning about it. It's just it's not able to roll forward in quite the same way. However, the teaching and assessing professionalism strand and the work with the portfolio will go ahead because those are separate. So these groups we will be setting up over the next short while. I'm hoping to have contacted people to be chairs of these groups by the end of this week, beginning of next, to try and get them up and running. And then, as I say, these will report into UMEC. I will go back to our pretty slides, and I've finished. Thank you very much for your time. You look like a penguin when you work like that. Did you know that's our new mascot?
I thought you knew the penguin?
We have a new mascot at the university, I learned this morning.
King Penguin.
Penny the Penguin, Professor of Penguinology, I believe.
Well, I'm not a professor yet, that's not me. Professor of Penguinology. One day. Okay, anybody got any questions or comments about any of that? Anything you'd like to say? Hang on. You get a microphone? Why don't you turn it on?
Hi Ellie, thanks for that. So I'm Nick, I'm a paediatrician. I think this is all really interesting, but does it matter what we want to teach them if we don't have the capacity to do it? Because I'm quite worried about 4th and 5th year.
Yeah, I think we all are. I mean, I can put a very positive spin on it, and of course I'm going to, because we are going to make it happen. But we can't design a curriculum which is undeliverable. So, I know that one anxiety people have is that what was the quote? We allow the school to be overrun by educationalists instead of getting on with medicine. And I would argue that if you put the educational theory in place correctly, then the getting on with medicine is much easier. So, I think when we are thinking about what we need to do, we've got 2 main drivers there. There's what we need our students to learn and be able to do and so on at the end, and then there's how we are realistically going to be able to do it. And I think we have to just keep coming back again and again to our capacity question. That's why in Maggie's diagram the summary of the issues. Capacity is the big circle around the outside because it's the stumbling block for everything otherwise. So hard, but it's what we've got to do.
If I can take chair's privilege for for a question. I think that, the capacity question, on one hand you've got what's the best way to teach 200 medical students is give a lecture. Big, here I am, I teach to everybody. And what do the students want? They want lots of small group sessions, which means you need 6 of me or 10 of me or 12 of me. And it's difficult as someone who comes along and does a lot of teaching, lots of blocks, when the lecture theatre isn't full and that people don't come. And I think we've got a real problem of the expectation of how students these days want to learn compared to how we all learnt and try to get over information to large groups of people. And I think we're going to have to make some kind of paradigm shift here into recording lectures, giving things to people, putting it out there, not being proud about this is my lecture and you only get to learn it if you come and sit in front of me. It just needs to be just all out there. And maybe we'll become the first medical school that doesn't have lectures. Maybe we'll become the first medical school who just puts everything out. And I think we really need to be quite bold with it, because if we don't do that, we're not going to have the capacity. Now, there's two. We'll go this way first. You can. I don't know if that was a question or a comment. I'm just talking.
It was like a conference question, Tom.
Yes.
It's just about the capacity. The slide was quite striking that in Ops and Gynae we have the worst mismatch. Have you thought about, is that because we are, is that the reduction in number of consultants or the time that's available?
That is what is currently available in the slots in terms of rotations available to students as things currently stand. So in terms of number of spaces available to students at any given time. So that's without having yet sat down with the department and working out whether there are ways that we can rearrange things, fit more students in, work smarter, other places where we could be sending students outside Tayside, which we don't do at the moment. There are lots of things we can be looking at, and we've got further along the conversations with the acute care block, for example, but we've been working with acute care knowing that the lessons we learn from that will have to be reproduced or extended elsewhere. So we're very aware of this as an issue, but we're at the point, we're not, this isn't a desperate, frantic scrabble. This is trying to make sure that we are making the improvements in a planned, useful, innovative way for students.
I'm just thinking it might be a historical figure perhaps, because we have had quite a lot of new recruitments.
Well, that should help.
Yeah.
Wendy, so this way first.
Hi, Craig Mark, gastroenterology. We're not obviously not the only medical school who's going to have to deal with capacity issues. And looking at the graphs which were shown earlier, we can see some medical schools have really improved significantly over the last few years. Do we know what the secret's been in these medical schools and why they're rating so highly now?
Well, so where they're improving in is their students' perception of preparedness for practice. And actually, in many cases, they are making those big advances by doing what we've been doing for years. So they now have decent length apprenticeship blocks, which we've been doing for ages. When we started doing it, it was dead innovative. So that's why we were high to start with. And the reason we're not, I think we're basically maxed out now because most of our students are getting a really good, properly authentic experience in final year. They really know what they are letting themselves in for when they become foundation doctors, because they have already spent a month at a time doing it with FY colleagues. So that's why we score so highly in that. And the other schools that are coming up sharply, they're coming up sharply because they are copying us, in the nicest sense.
Fiona McFatter from Palliative Care. The first one is a comment when you look at the capacities and it's represented as blocks. So for some small specialties that teach within that block, the gap might be even bigger.
Yes.
So for example, we teach within medicine, so the gap would be bigger to because to try and accommodate more students would be much more difficult, and I think there'll be other small themes and specialties that find that even more of a challenge. The other thing was a question, because if I've remembered the dates correctly, it looks like student numbers will increase the year before the sort of go date for the new curriculum, and I'm just wondering what the strategy is for that.
Well, they will, but they'll increase in fact, Maggie, sorry, you're the expert in Scott Gem Year 3, so why don't you do this bit? I'll sugar over.
Can you repeat the question?
It was that the increase is going to happen the year before the go date,
yeah.
and then
Yes.
the smaller specialties bit.
Yeah. So although we've got the rollout date for starting at year 1, at whenever it is, 2021, we will need to look at what we do in year 4 and 5 in advance of that, because of the Scott Gem students coming in at that point when they do, but also the year before. The Scott Gem students in year 3 won't be doing the year 4 curriculum, the Dundee year 4 curriculum. What the plan for them is that they'll do the longitudinal integrated clerkship that you may have heard of as DLIC. So they will be spread out over the whole of Scotland. And it may be that we have a small-ish number here in Tayside, perhaps 10 or 15, but the rest of them will be elsewhere. So while the numbers look bigger, the actual reality of that change isn't going to be quite as big. And then the LIC does things in a different way, so the students aren't working in blocks. They're meeting their own, addressing their own learning needs depending on the patients they see elsewhere. So they might come in and do one clinic, or they might just stay and see one patient in one clinic, and then they'll go away again. And you wouldn't have any responsibility for tutorials or block timetables or anything like that for those. So it's a very different way of doing things. And one of the things that I think we need to think about is whether we can look at using some of those LIC principles for Dundee Year 4 to see if we can manage capacity that way. And it also comes back to what we were saying about IT, that if as a block lead you're having to deliver the same tutorial 10 times, is there a better way of doing that actually frees you up to do teaching in a different way? So I think we need to really kind of go back to the drawing board with Year 4 in a way, and just think about how we can teach it effectively with the capacity that we've got across all the specialties.
I think related to that is something about defining what's core. So really making sure that we know what it is. So palliative care is a great example of that. What is it that we really feel is the core experience for palliative care that every student needs? And then how do we make sure that we are able to provide that bit? And then, so once we've done that, if there's anything spare, we think about building that into SSCs, things like that. So there's going to need to be some re-engineering of things like the specialist blocks, because you're absolutely right, all of the smaller specialties have got exactly that issue. But also, I don't think I can't see any of our ENT colleagues in the room, so apologies if I'm taking your name in vain, but the discussion I've had with ENT is that actually what we teach in Dundee is quite a lot more than other places do. So it may be that we want to think about how we provide that in the future, whether students are getting more exposure to that. I don't mean that please don't quote me as saying we're going to cut our ENT teaching. That's not what I'm saying. But at the moment, they're probably getting a lot of specialist teaching in that setting, whereas some of those things could be perhaps more generalisable, more generic, spread out over different areas.
I think then it would be good to appreciate things not as specialty
Yes.
specific, because even though you might think what is core palliative care, and I know I'm speaking out my specialty, but actually when you look at the core stuff of clinical reasoning,
Yes, absolutely, exactly.
Lots of departments will have a lot to offer out with their specialty specific role.
One last question in the last 90 seconds.
Hi, I was going to ask, are there any formal mechanisms within the curriculum review to assess the impact that changes will have on student mental health and well-being? Because, for example, if, say, lectures were made mandatory or made, video available, it would have a huge impact on the day-to-day functioning, of individual students, what their week looks like, the amount of autonomy they have, and it seems a lot of these changes are very unilateral.
Well, so that's not in any way an accurate representation to describe them as unilateral. So 1% of the entire student body was present at the away day last week. So we are ensuring that student representation is built in, student partnership is built into every stage of the curriculum redesign. But the other thing is formal evaluations are very important. Formal evaluation specifically of the impact on mental health, I'm not sure that's what we want to do. However, continuous monitoring and supervision of our students' mental health is really important. So I'm not sure that I necessarily want to try and causally link the two, but we very, very aware that student support is a key element of what we're thinking about, trying to have better, longer, more engaged educational supervision for students so that they can have long-term educational relationships with medical school staff is part of our strategy for thinking about things, trying to ensure that students are getting better pastoral support through the process. So that's where we want to focus it, rather than necessarily bringing it down to a very specific thing about linking the mental health aspects and the curriculum itself.
I think it's really important to say that there's no decision about making lectures
That's also
compulsory. That's probably not something that we've talked out enough yet. But the other thing is that part of the thing is reducing the overall content of the course. Yeah, there's too much in it at the moment. So hopefully that's something that would end up having students feel less burdened by it.
Okay, I'm going to have to draw things to a close because we're knocking on for 2 o'clock. Obviously lots of discussion generated. I suspect they'll stay around and answer more questions if you have them.
Yeah, and contact us. If you want to talk about it, please get in touch.
Next week, no title as yet, because due to unforeseen circumstances there's a gap. So if you have something you want to talk about, then let me know. Otherwise, it's probably me. All right? Just like to thank our speakers again and thank you all for coming. See you next week.